Okay, measure for measure, really now in conclusion. We've been noting up until now the way in which Shakespeare asks us to see the action of the play through the generic lens of the morality play. We've been thinking a lot about Shakespeare's use of genre, and here the invocation of, well, several genres really. Comedy is a genre, the morality play is a genre, then really the New Testament conception of time as another lens through which we see the action of the play. Truth is the daughter of time. But as we've been discussing, the morality play gives us a lens through which we see the characters of the play, Angelo as justice, Isabel as mercy, and in some sense the Duke as a providential figure, Lucio perhaps as Satan. We did see the way in which Shakespeare shows us the extent to which this morality lens really fails to capture the reality of what's happening in Vienna. And although a critic like G. Wilson Knight encourages us to see the play itself as a kind of morality play, there's a lot of dissonance in this play, as well as we've been discussing in a play like As You Like It, even though there's a slight sense of dissonance about the way genre functions, it really is a play that delivers things as you like it. And in Measure for Measure, the sense of dissonance seems to really overwhelm that sense of harmony. And notwithstanding the fact that this is a comedy, and we know it's a comedy because there are weddings at the end, notwithstanding the sense that there's a comedy, there is that sense of dissonance. And part of that is perhaps the dissonance that we feel between the characters and what they're meant to represent. We saw this in a kind of representative scene, which we didn't pass over, but we looked at mainly for the laughs. That is the scene with Elbow and Angelo prosecuting Pompey. Elbow is the bumbling justice, and Pompey is the bawd. Angelo, however, before the case is even heard of the two stolen prunes, dismisses the whole case, walks away, and says and proclaims out loud, "We want to whip them all." That is, Angelo's abstract sense of justice is in many ways just useless in the real world of alleged insults and not prunes, but eaten figs. So there's some sense that real life resists the kind of absolute justice which Angelo hopes to dispense. In other ways, we saw the way in which allegorical personifications fail to accurately convey reality. For example, obviously most strikingly, in the characters of Isabel and Angelo. Most obviously, the character Angelo fails to live up to his conception of justice, seduced by Isabel's sense. Angelo falls into depravity, clearly not living up to the strict ideal of justice which we had come to expect of him. We also suggested, I think last time, that it's Angelo's very urgency about justice that portrays an inner self which is confused or upset or very much not really in balance. And that sense of justice perhaps comes to respond to the desire, lust that he later feels to Isabella. And perhaps we would have suggested such a result from Angelo because he represents this kind of Pharisaic, Hebraic justice, which we know will be ultimately transcended by the end of the play. As we spoke about, measure for measure, Old Testament justice is ultimately transcended by a New Testament kind of mercy. Isabel herself, however, presents a no less complex figure. She, like Angelo, is the virtuous absolutist, so committed to her own virtue that she wants to take even more restrictions than the already restrictive life of the nunnery. Remember, she shows up at the nunnery and wants to know, what else can I take on? What other strict rules can I take on? And she enters this nunnery of St. Clare's, which already has a reputation of being one of the most strict of nunneries in the city of Vienna. So we suggested, well, what's Isabella's backstory? Of course, we can only speculate about that, but it might lead us to the speculation of, well, what is the thing that makes Isabella want to become so religiously strict? As we noted in our discussions last time, her repressive and religious outside seems in some ways to conceal a different Isabella, revealed, though maybe unconsciously. We spoke about the way in which characters in this play, especially Isabella and Angelo, are often having two sets of conversations, one in which the simple meanings of their words are conveyed, and the other in which they're speaking about things of which they themselves are not aware. Kind of, as we suggested last time, a text with which Freud would obviously have a field day. When Isabella refuses to take on, to sleep with Angelo on behalf of her brother, she responds, "The impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies and strip myself to death as to a bed." Lucio had earlier commented on, or Claudio had commented on, his sister's prone and speechless dialect. Again, we don't know if that's suggestive because Claudio wants it to be, or his speech is outgoing him in some way. But Isabella, in the very moment of refusing to give up her body, speaks in very explicitly kind of masochistic terms, sexual terms. "The impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies and strip myself to death as to a bed." Again, Isabella speaks really more than she knows. Remember when she talks about the sin that she abhors to mention, and she keeps on saying abhor. She hates to mention the very sin of whoring that she keeps on mentioning, even as she abhors to speak about it. So there's obviously, in Measure for Measure, a kind of discrepancy between appearance and reality, name and thing. Neither Isabella nor Angelo are what they think they are. Remember, Angelo says at a certain point, "Let's write angel on the devil's horn." That's where Angelo has some sense of self-consciousness. In any event, we wonder about G. Wilson Knight, who had this theory about Measure for Measure as a morality play. Reality seems to be far more complex than the expectations that Shakespeare has created with this structure. It is obviously important to note Shakespeare's the one who gives us this structure, gives us these expectations. Like with comedy, he gives us gives us the genre. With the genre, he gives us a set of expectations, and then he either goes on to meet them or not to meet them. And it seems in Measure for Measure, much differently from As You Like It, he's really not meeting them. Indeed, Shakespeare seems compelled to show that abstract moral categories will fail to adequately explain or anticipate the complexity of human situations. This gets dramatized in many ways in the play. Note Isabella's assurance at the end of Act 2, scene 4, line 178. Isabella is absolutely convinced of her brother's rectitude of his his righteousness. So again, 2:4:178. "Though he had fallen by promisure of blood, yet hath he in him such a mind of honor, that had he 20 heads to tender down on 20 blocks, he yield them up, before his sister should her body stoop to such abhorred pollution. Then Isabel lived chaste and brother die. More than our brother is our chastity. I'll tell him yet of Angela's request and fit his mind to death for his soul's rest." Isabel is a morally certain character, and the certainty that Claudio will prepare for death. The Duke, who, as we noted, is this kind of providential figure, this guiding figure. We saw anticipatory characters like him, who, the friar in Romeo and Juliet, who is a bumbling version of the Duke, an ineffective version of the Duke. Rosalind in As You Like It, who is a excellent precedent for the Duke, really, because it's through her magic that things are delivered as we like it. The Duke has similar ideas and reinforces this notion as he comes to console Claudio before his death. This is, following along at home, 3:1, 5-13. Again, the Duke urges Claudio, "Be absolute for death. Either death or life shall thereby be the sweeter. Reason thus with life. If I do lose thee, I do lose a thing that none but fools would keep. Thou hast no youth nor age, but as it were an after dinner sleep, dreaming on both. For all thy blessed youth becomes as aged, and doth beg the alms of palsied age." Where we hear echoes of Jacques' The 7 Ages of Man from As You Like It, We also kind of anticipate one of the soliloquies, which we'll be seeing, of Hamlet, of this very depressing version of life. And the Duke's idea is to get Claudio so depressed about his prospects in life that he embraces death, as he says he will. So we said the Duke is like a kind of glorified touchstone, speaking much more eloquently. From hour to hour we ripe and ripen, then from hour to hour we rot and rot. But here in this Christian play, it is a kind of Christian consolation that will lead Claudio to be resigned with his death. One of the questions we might be asking now as you're reading the plays, what is the Duke doing here? I think the simple answer is the Duke is showing his powers in stage crafting the action of the play, or really directing the action of the play. He's preparing Claudio for death. And Claudio's immediate response is, I humbly thank you. To sue to live, I find I seek to die, and seeking death, find life. Let it come on. Sounds like Donne's holy sonnet. Death be not proud, I'd rather seek death, and in death I find life. Let it come on. So the Duke seems at first at least convincing and successful in trying to argue with Claudio to see his life through the lens of Christian categories and to give up any promise of his current life for life in the future. Thus we note Claudio's continued resolve in the early part of his meeting with Isabella. If I must die, again another sex and death. Of course, this is not only here, but in Romeo and Juliet. If I must die, I will encounter darkness as a bride and hug it in mine arms. But as we'll see, Claudio's resolve is not as resolute as the Duke would have hoped. And eventually, in the scene between Claudio and his sister Isabella, and I recommend that you look again at this Act 2, Scene 4, or Act 3, Scene 1, as it's played in the New Globe Theatre production, we kind of see the violence between them, the disappointment that Isabella feels once she realizes that Claudio will not follow the Duke's directions. He says, line 115, death is a fearful thing. If they had conditioned Claudio to not fear death, Claudio finds, again, we find ourselves moving from absolutes to life, from Angelo's justice into the real life of Vienna, of the two figs. Here we move from the Duke's absolute constructions of death, but Claudio remembers what real life is. Death is a fearful thing. Another way of putting it might be that while the Duke and Isabella both have created narratives to which Claudio should accede, he ultimately doesn't agree. Another way really thinking of art in Measure for Measure, and maybe back to As You Like It. In As You Like It, art is very much triumphant. It's through art that life is ordered. Here there seems to be some sense in which the artifice, the stage directions that the Duke is offering somehow don't accord or parallel life itself. So both the Duke and Isabel fail in the sense that they fail to have Claudio surrender to their absolute and simple vision of the world. And we remember Isabella's violent response, the response, "O you beast, O faithless coward, O dishonest wretch, wilt thou be made a man out of my sin?" Is it not a kind of incest to take life from thine own sister's shame? As we've been mentioning, and As You Like It, in Shakespeare's earlier comedies, we have images of healthy sexuality, or really romance, not so much sexuality, but romance. Here in Vienna, there's not only the poisonous and toxic sexuality of Mistress Overdone's hothouse, but also the sense of incest. Is it not a kind of incest to take thy life from thy own sister's shame? A clever idea of what incest entails. What should I think? Heaven shield me my mother's play. Heaven shield my mother played my father fair, for such a warped slip of wilderness ne'er issued from his blood. Take my defiance, die, perish. Again, as some of us pointed out when we saw this last time, it seems like a strange set of lines to see in a comedy. Certainly the tone is something that is dissonant. Of course, we said nobody dies in comedy. But my bending down reprieve thee from thy fate. It should proceed. I'll pray 1,000 prayers for thy death. No word to save thee. So again, here again we see that the categories of allegory or the morality play fail to work. What happened to Isabel's famous interest in mercy? She turns really into her opposite. She is now screaming for justice. And later Isabel says, I had rather my brother die by the law than my son should be unlawfully born. The figure of mercy, again, embracing justice. That is, Isabella, like Angelo, are transforming into their opposite. Remember Freud's famous phrasing from the antithetical meaning of primal words, that any concept only gets its meaning from its opposite concept. And for Freud, of course, that is the source of an important set of psychological insights, that sometimes if one sees one extreme, one can see the other extreme or anticipate the other extreme showing itself. Remember also that Rosalind, the psychologically healthy character in Shakespeare, probably the most psychologically helpful character in Shakespeare, she hates extremes. She calls extremity, you will look back at as you like it and see her precise phrasing, but in relationship to Jacques and Sylvius, she sees one as enthusiastic love, Sylvius, Jacques as cynicism, and both to her are equally abhorrent. In Angelo and Isabel, we have the grabbing of one extreme, and of course the grabbing of that extreme, that vehement grabbing of one extreme, turns it into its opposite. The Duke says to Claudio at the end of this scene, where Claudio ceases to be consoled, the Duke says simply, tomorrow you must die. It's just worth mentioning again, we discussed this last time, that in the source play Promos and Cassandra, the figure of Isabella actually does give in to the Angelo character's desire for her body, and nonetheless in the prelude or prologue to that poem, she's nonetheless called chaste. So again, we see, and it's important to always emphasize with Shakespeare, how he takes source material, appropriates it, takes it for his own, transforms it, and really makes something entirely new. Here he's kind of forcing the reader into a set of moral choices that the source play doesn't actually do. Now, we've been mentioning the Duke, Angelo, and Isabel. Let's come back to the Duke. We talked about Isabella's, or the Duke's, failure to get Claudio on board with their narrative. The Duke, as this figure of providence, is aligned again and again in Measure for Measure with time. In Act 4, Scene 2, he says, the time is come even now, that the sense that, for of course, when we talk in Measure for Measure about the time coming even now, this idea of ripeness, that things are coming to their fruition, things are being fulfilled. The Duke says, the time has come even now. Later in Act 4, Scene 2, he says, look, the unfolding stars calls up the shepherd. Put not yourself into amazement how these things should be. All difficulties are but easy when they are known. This idea of things coming to light, of things being known. Later on, Angelo, in relationship to, this is really in Act 5, Scene 1, which we'll get to, when Mariana and Isabel come and entreat the Duke, Angelo says, I do perceive these poor informal women are no more but instruments of some more mightier member that sets them on. Instruments of some more mightier member that sets them on. So the Duke, in Angelo's understanding, is the figure behind everything, this kind of providential figure, and Mariana and Isabella are just agents. That is, Angelo admits that the Duke is the force behind the action, like Rosalind, a kind of comic, but here Christian stage director. Again, the Duke's confidence in the promised revelation of truth. Truth is the daughter of time. The promise, as in the Gospels we saw in Mark and Luke, of bringing things to light. And the Duke is really promising the coming of things to light. But given Angelo's public understanding of mercy and his continued insistence upon strict justice, it seems that the hoped for resolution, the expected triumph of mercy, will at least be delayed. The coming of light, of truth, seems to be very long in coming. In fact, as we said, the title of the play, Measure for Measure, and those are the words that Angelo lives by, promise a very different ending than the one of comedy. Measure for Measure ends in death, obviously, not in comic resolution, emphasizing a limited conception of justice and not mercy. We remember what Lucio says about Angelo to the disguised Duke. It is certain that when he makes water, his urine is congealed ice. That I know to be true. And later he says, I would the Duke we talk of were returned again. This is Lucio. This ungendered agent will unpeople the province with continency. That is, Angelo, the ungendered agent, will unpeople the province with continency. Angelo's absolute conception of justice, at least as he manifests it, at least as he shows it publicly, is threatening to rid all of Vienna of any life. According to Angelo's strict justice, the social affirmation we might expect in a comedy never comes. Pompey had earlier asked, does your worship mean to geld and splay all the youth of the city? Echoing what he says, or anticipating what he says later, that Angelo will unpeople the province. But Angelo doesn't end in life, in flowering, in ripeness, in fruition, but just death. Again, Lucio, does your worship mean to geld and splay all the youth of the city? Are you going to make further procreation impossible? So this is kind of in the background. There's this image of an ending to Measure for Measure, not of reaffirmation of life, but of death. It's, of course, associated with Angelo. As we continue, according to Lucio, he's got a very different conception of who the Duke is. According to him, we have no expectation of any eventual revelation. The Duke is not seen so much as an agent of providence, but someone who is likely to prevent the eventual revelation of truth or mercy. The Duke, says Angelo, this is Act 4, the Duke, says Lucio, the Duke yet would have dark deeds darkly answered. He would never bring them to light. So Lucio, the satanic character, looks at the Duke as not a figure of the unfolding of truth, but rather the Duke as a figure who is the Duke of dark corners, who would never bring things to light. The Duke is hounded by Lucio with an alternative vision. He's the old, fantastical Duke of dark corners. Lucio's old, fantastical Duke of dark corners is an ironic commentary upon the figure of the Duke, his self-conception, a figure who is bringing things to light. And at one point we have to kind of ask or address, why is it that the Duke is seen to fail? I mean, he always says, as we've mentioned, well, the time has come, but very often we see the Duke pulled up short. That is, the letter that he's expecting doesn't come. The person that he's expecting doesn't come. The stay of execution doesn't come. So we have to take that into account also, why it is, unlike Rosalind in As You Like It, who kind of seamlessly weaves the action at the end of the play, the Duke seems to be having a much harder time. Rosalind is that magician who is able to bring the end of the play to its comic fruition, not so much for the Duke, who seems in exercising his providence is a kind of ineffective manipulator. We have very different sense, I think, of Rosalind and the Duke. Rosalind definitely very much a benign, a benevolent character, figure of magic, of benign magic, I conjure you. The Duke, on the other hand, is associated with a certain Christian vision, which seems, at the very best, kind of more clunky and more awkward, and maybe even manipulative at worst. Another way in which we kind of see the Duke's failure, or maybe perhaps we could say the failure of Providence, and again we have to ask, is this a religious play? And it seems like it must be, because so much of the language of the play is religious. Again, when we ask that question, we don't really care so much about what Shakespeare's own religious beliefs are, only so much that we're interested in kind of hypothesizing the intention behind Measure for Measure. So does the author of this work, does Shakespeare intend this to have some kind of, however complex, religious or moral message? Now, a key part of the whole scheme that the Duke has organized is to make sure that a head is delivered to Angelo such that he will think that Claudio has been killed. That is, in the absence of Claudio's pardon never shows up, the Duke has to figure out a way of appeasing Angelo. So his idea is, you bring in this prisoner Barnardine, this bulky hulk of desire of a man, and Barnardine basically says, I'm not ready to die. I've been drinking all day and sleeping all night, and I will not consent to die today, that's certain. So Barnardine, of all of the characters of the play, represents this kind of materiality or physicality. If we say that, or if we, as we've been saying, that the generic lens, or one of them, is the morality play with ideas or concepts or ideals on the one side, Barnardine is on the absolute other side of the continuum with the rest of Vianney's life, but Barnardine is a kind of distillation, it's a kind of pure version of just lust, physicality, desire, and just the body. And he just says, I'm busy. I will not consent to die today, that's certain. Barnardine is unripe, which says he's unfit and or unwilling to accommodate himself to the Duke's command, or maybe in the terms we've been suggesting, unwilling or unable to accommodate himself to the Duke's narrative. The Duke has this providential narrative. Barnardine is part of it, and he basically says, I'm not playing. The Duke has this desire to have Barnardine fit into the story as he's arranging things, and Barnardine basically decides he's not going to be part of it. This provides a parallel with what we've already seen in regards to Claudio. Life seems to resist the Duke's schemes. In some sense, we might say, and we'll come back to this, that life resists art or artifice. And as you like it, somehow art and life are in tune one with the other. Here, art fails in some sense, at least the art of the Duke, fails to come to terms with life as it actually is. Barnardine is the perfect example, the paradigm moment for this in the play, in which he refuses to be subordinated into the contours of the Duke's story. We continue in Act 5, the one scene, Act 5, to have an expectation of a comic end when Isabella and Mariana entreat the Duke, O gracious Duke, harp not on that, nor do not banish reason for inequality, but let your reason serve to make the truth appear where it seems hid, and hide the false seems true. So the Duke is being appealed to, Mariana and Isabel, to reveal the truth, for the truth to make itself appear. Again, there is this emphasis of on Christian time. Then, O you blessed ministers above, this is line 118, keep me in patience, and with ripened time unfold the evil, which is here wrapped up in countenance. This idea in countenance, hidden, darkened. In some sense, Isabella and Mariana at the end of the play are hoping for this revelation, and they see the Duke being the agent of that revelation. He's a kind of problematic agent in some ways, because he lies in ways as to disappoint and really taunt Isabella at various times. He tells her that Claudio actually has been beheaded. It's really not really clear what she wants from that, or why he would, what kind of mileage he's getting out of that in his providential story. I don't know, is the Duke a kind of control freak? In any event, in Act 5, Scene 1, there is the beginning of what Aristotle calls anagnorisis. Look it up, anagnorisis, which means revelation, the unfolding, and we see a series of revelations. What was Aristotle's favorite anagnorisis? The revelation of Odysseus by the nurse Heraclian, Book 19 of the Odyssey, the kind of revelation of a face through which not only the face of a person, but in which more things are revealed. So in Act 5, Scene 1 is really a scene of revelation and literal unveilings, starting with Mariana, who comes to confront Angelo. My husband bids me, now I will unmask. Remember, Angelo and Mariana were engaged to be wed. Mariana didn't show up with the dowry. Angelo abandons her, of course, according to the Duke's scheme. He has already now in Act 5, Scene 1, slept with her. We'll come back to that. So he's already done basically the same thing that Claudio has done with Julietta. Angelo, his reaction is, oh my dreadlord, I should be guiltier, this is line 365, I should be guiltier than my guiltiness, to think I can be undiscernible when I perceive your grace. By the end of the play, there's no more promise of being undiscernible. Things are now revealed. When I perceive your grace, like power divine, hath looked upon my passes. Then, good prince, no longer session hold upon my shame, but let my trial be my own confession. A median sentence, then, and sequent death is all the grace I beg. Again, here Angelo is true to his own character. What does Angelo want? Measure for measure, to mute the tones of mercy, and to have the play and his life end in strict justice. And the Duke, for the time being, echoes an Angelo for Claudio, death for death, haste still pays haste, and leisure answers leisure, like doth quit like, and measure still for measure. It's kind of the sing-songy rhymed couplets we've talked about in relationship to all of Shakespeare's plays. It's almost as if the play is coming to its conclusion. The rhymes give the verse a kind of finality, kind of return us to a generic world in which everything is going to make sense. Here, strict justice will rule. But we see, notwithstanding the Duke here, he continues, and he's not only manipulating Isabella, later Julietta, but his continued deceit involves a continued holding back of the truth. I mean, you guys can decide for yourselves why the Duke does this. Power freak, or is he testing Angelo, testing Isabella, testing Julietta? I mean, the whole play begins, of course, with the test of Angelo. The Duke really takes upon himself certain kind of godlike powers. At the end of the play, Act 5, Scene 1, here we're on 434, the Duke says, sweet Isabella, say you but kneel by me, hold up your hands, say nothing. And Isabella responds, most bounteous sir, look if it please you, on this man condemned as if my brother lived, I partly think a Duke's sincerity governed his deeds. Again, of course, as we mentioned, the women in Shakespeare get the very best scenes, and Isabella, despite her journey from mercy to justice, does come back to mercy. Since it is so, let him not die. My brother had him not justice, in that he did the thing for which he died. For Angelo, his act does not o'ertake his bad intent, and must be buried but as an intent, that perished by the way. Thoughts are no subjects, intents, but merely thoughts. In Isabella here making an argument to have mercy on Angelo, really quite an extraordinary scene. The Duke's answer is, line 488, If he be like your brother, for his sake is he pardoned, and for your lovely sake give me your hand and say you will be mine. He is my brother too. Is that a proposal? I guess it looks like it. Is anything in the play prepare us for that? I mean, we're kind of prepared for the coupling between Angelo and Isabella, meaning we see the sexual energy between them. I mean, Lucio makes some kind of snide remarks about the Duke's sexuality, but there's no preparation for this relationship. We'll come back to that as well. But fitter time for that. By this Lord Angelo perceives he's safe. Methinks I see a quickening in his eye. Angelo scheming even at this point. Well, Angelo, your evil quits you well. Look that you love your wife, her worth yours. I find an apt remission in myself. And yet here's one in my place I cannot pardon. You, sirrah, that knew me for a fool, a coward. We talked about exclusions in As You Like It. Who gets excluded? Jacques, I am not for dancing measure. Celia gets Oliver, not so bad after he's kind of become a better guy, but she really wanted Rosalind. Phoebe is stuck with Silvius, but overwhelmingly the sense is in the play of harmony. Here, at the end of the play, we have sense of not so much harmony, but rather lack of harmony. So we have in the scene, in Act 5, and do watch the last act, the Globe production, we have a series of revelations. Mariana reveals herself, Anagnorisis, revelation. The Duke, formerly the friar, reveals himself. The triumph of justice, of mercy over justice, and the promised generic end of comedy. Claudio lives, even though the Duke had kind of taunted Giulietta with the continued prospect of his death. But at the end, there's the affirmation of the generic ends of comedy. Claudio marries Giulietta. Again, we can say, well, maybe like we might read the Odyssey, that their suffering of Odysseus makes the ending, the return to Ithaca, all the better. Perhaps we could say here, the continued suffering of Giulietta makes the revelation of Claudio's life all the better, although that seems like a very hard meaning of the play to maintain. We'll come back to the ending in a minute. First, maybe just to mention Samuel Coleridge, who wrote about Measure for Measure. Didn't like the play very much. Measure for Measure is the single exception to the delightfulness of Shakespeare's plays. So As You Like It, delightful. Midsummer Night's Dream, obviously, delightful. He must mean comedies here. It is a hateful work. Our feelings of justice are grossly wounded in Angelo's escape. So Coleridge finds that Angelo's escape doesn't live up to our sense of what's just. Now, of course, it's kind of a bind for Shakespeare, because if he allows for justice, then the generic contract of comedy becomes unfulfilled. So it's a no-win for Coleridge. Either we get a comedy in which the ending is unsatisfactory because Angelo gets away, or Angelo doesn't get away and we don't have a comedy. So Coleridge feels this distaste for the ending, that though mercy triumphs, here mercy does not seem appropriate to Angelo's crime. Really, Isabella's argument isn't so compelling. Here, as Coleridge suggests, the generic end, the revelation of time and the triumph of mercy, does not seem to accord with our sense of justice. The two are really in conflict. And you could say that's a failure of the play, which is what Coleridge is suggesting. Or you can say that Shakespeare is, at the end of his career, using comedy or relating to comedy in a much, much different way than he did when he wrote As You Like It in 1600. Again, this is written in 1604, the last comedy that Shakespeare was to write. And we wonder at the end of the play if it really is a satisfying ending. The Duke says, where to, if you'll a willing ear incline, what's mine is yours, and what yours is mine. Again, we return to rhyming couplets. So bring us to our palace, and where we'll show what's yet behind that meets you, all should know. The Duke had before in the play suggested that he had no interest in marriage. And the Duke and Isabel have shown no interest in each other. Angelo and Mariana marry under duress, and the Duke and Isabella form a union with the most uncertain of possible futures. The rhymed verse signals not only the conclusion of the play, but a conscious admission, perhaps, by the author, by Shakespeare, that what we're seeing, what we're witness to, is really just the stuff of art. It's unreal. I mean, we're left at the end of the play to imagine what happens to the Duke, or how does Isabella respond to the Duke's proposal. It's, of course, a very suggestive moment, and I guess part of the advantage of being a reader and not a director is that we can think of all the possibilities. A director has to choose one of them, right? I mentioned the most extreme one, which I think probably should never be put on, but probably should be in the back of our minds when we read it, is the Duke proposes, Isabel, this is a production in 70s garb, Isabel reaches into her purse, takes out a shotgun, and shoots herself. That shows kind of that reading, the extent to which the play fails as a comedy. So I think in the Globe production and some other productions, perhaps you've seen an older BBC production, there's a kind of tentative embrace of the Duke. Isabella tentatively embraces him. Again, it's hard to imagine. Really, it's hard to imagine their future. We said in As You Like It, it's hard to imagine the future of Orlando and Rosalind, meaning all we have is their romance. We don't know what their marriage will look like. Here, the prospects of Isabella and the Duke are almost impossible to imagine. Again, it's almost as if Shakespeare says, I'm ending my comedy here, and you think into the future, who knows what it will be. One more issue about questions of art and artifice and endings. We didn't mention really Mariana and the bed trick that works here. Swinburne, 19th century author, writes about Mariana's presence. I'll just read a little bit of Swinburne for you. The evasion of a tragic end by the invention and intromission of Mariana has deserved and received high praise for its ingenuity. But ingenious evasion of a natural and proper end is usually the distinctive quality which denotes a workman of a very much lower school than the school of Shakespeare. You might think of what classical play is it? What ancient Greek play depends upon ingenuity. Aristotle hated it. The deus ex machina of Medea, the chariot falling from the sky. Here, Swinburne says of Shakespeare, great authors don't do this. Great authors don't introduce a figure like Mariana at the end. Bad ones do. In short and in fact, the whole elaborate machinery by which the complete and completely unsatisfactory result of the whole plot is attained is thoroughly worthy of such a contriver as the old fantastical Duke of Dark Corners, as to be in a moral sense, if I dare say what I think, very far from thoroughly worth of the wisest and mightiest mind that ever was informed with the spirit of genius of creative poetry. For Swinburne, this ending is associated not with a figure of moral clarity, but with Lucio's old fantastical Duke of Dark Corners, meaning you have to rely on something ingenious, something that doesn't organically flow from the action in order to bring things to the end, worthy not of the providential or supposedly providential figure of the Duke, but the Duke of Dark Corners. Now we spoke about Shakespearean comedy, Saturnalian comedy, the ABA structure, court, country court, Midsummer Night's Dream, As You Like It. Vienna, of course, is one place. There's no movement out of Vienna. There is disguise, but the disguise is not for self-revelation, but rather for surveillance. There isn't more than one place in Measure for Measure as there was in As You Like It, with the one exception of the Grange. The Grange is the place, of course, where the bed trick between Mariana, the shared, the bed that Isabella yields to Mariana so she can sleep with her formerly betrothed husband, Angelo, the Grange is the place where that happens. In a sense, the Grange is a leftover from that comic and fantastical world of Saturnalia. But instead of being a place where everybody goes to, it's this one isolated place, a place sealed off from the otherwise corrupted world of Vienna. Thinking, how does the bed trick function within the action of the play? The inclusion of Mariana, like the coincidental death of the prisoner in Pirate Ragozin, remember, he's the guy who just by chance happens to die, so a head can be presented to Angelo. Remember, Barnardine, he's too tired and not ripe for death. So like the scene of Ragozin, Mariana acts as a means by which the play can come to its conclusion. But whereas in As You Like It, we could see the relationship between the court and the forest, and it didn't seem unnatural for those who were temporarily sojourning there, the Grange and the bed trick seem totally artificial, totally unreal. Again, As You Like It, there's a kind of an organic development. The movement from court to city, to court, release to clarification, disguise, give a person a mask and see who they are. The Grange is this kind of artificial world. Again, I mean, Shakespeare, I think unlike Swinburne's reading, we might suggest that it's not an accident for Shakespeare. Shakespeare is kind of showing his hand, showing his artifice. And perhaps in his later play, Measure for Measure, he doesn't have the confidence in art or artifice that he had in the play written in 1600. There, art really orders life. Here we see art really failing in some sense. And the Grange itself, the place of the artistic resolution of the play, since it announces itself as so artificial, shows us, or again, shows Shakespeare's hand in telling us, look at the artifice involved here in order to bring things to their conclusion. You know, Shakespeare uses, as Swinburne says, he's almost like the Duke of Dark Corners, using the stock and trade of comedy to bring his endings to an end. As we're saying again and again in Measure for Measure, there's a sense in which life is outstripping art. That life, just like the Viennese sexuality, can't be contained by the law and justice of Angelo, so the life of the characters in Measure for Measure can't be properly contained or described by the figures of artifice. Again, the Duke's plan for Mariana's deception of Angelo is the only means by which the play can come to its comic conclusion. But the strangeness of the environment and Mariana's own relationship with Angelo provides a too simple, almost too artificial means by which the play can conclude. What is this artifice evidence of? Lack of skill on the part of the playwright? Or perhaps, as we've been suggesting, this is just really a review, a deliberate strategy. That is to show that the comic endings for places like Vienna, and maybe the places where we live as well, can only be achieved by relying upon the props from the generic storehouse of comedy. That is, in this play, Shakespeare exposes the artifice of comedy, shows us how they work. That life, whether Pompey's prune pits, Claudio, or the general texture of life, resists the ordered patterns of art. The Duke in this reading is not merely or only the enlightened agent of time. Remember, that's what G. Wilson Knight says, enlightened rational figure. The possibly divine figure who brings about the generic end of Christian comedy, but he is a figure for the artist who is only barely able to fit the recalcitrant aspects of life into a pattern. So this is like Shakespeare thinking again about the powers of art. We said As You Like It, in some sense, was a defense of art, an apology for poetry, showing in the terms of As You Like It how the as if comes to inform the is. Isabel's I conjure you, taking the world of holiday play into the world of the everyday world. Here, Shakespeare seems to be showing, perhaps skeptically, perhaps cynically, the limitations of art. And maybe the limitations also, is this a religious play? Maybe the limitations of a theological worldview that revolves around absolutes, meaning perhaps the absolutes that G. Wilson Knight talks about are not really sufficient to, not only for the worldview of Vienna, but for thinking about providence, justice, and mercy. Again, Shakespeare provides us a figure of the Duke, really, who fails very much in relationship to Rosalind. He's kind of a hybrid between the friar and Rosalind. Rosalind because he is successful, friar because he really is bumbling. He might in fact serve as a figure for the playwright who, in trying to bring about a comic ending, to fulfill the generic contract, can only do so at the expense of our belief, that is the Duke. The Duke brings about the comic ending, but some of us, like Isabella in that production where she takes out the gun, some of us are not buying. There are just too many loose ends. Dissonance overwhelms harmony. The Duke brings about the comic ending, but it's one in which things simply don't fit. This is not a failure of artistic control. There's a difference between the failure of artistic control and the representation of the Duke's failure of control. So it's not the failure of artistic control on Shakespeare's part, but it's a failure of artistic control which Shakespeare represents, that is the Duke's failure. This is not a failure of Shakespeare's artistic control, Swinburne suggests, but rather a final interrogation of an artistic vision of the world which will bring out happy endings. This leads, as measure for measure, Shakespeare's last comedy, to the abandonment of this generic form. For one with contours less reassuring, less optimistic, but perhaps more in line with life as it is, that is tragedy.